The system did not fail all at once. It simply decided who would be left behind. Lyra then heard it first as a distant vibration through the support struts, a low humming pressure that turned the floor of the survey chamber into something alive beneath her boots. Her visor showed stable readings a moment ago, but now every metric began to drift, recalibrating in uneasy loops. Seismic variance rising. Structural integrity declining across section C9. Above her, kilometers of reinforced tunnel and mineral rock stretched toward the surface, but the mine no longer felt engineered. It felt like something holding its breath too long, waiting for permission to break. On the surface control deck, Ethan Cole stood with one hand resting on the edge of a diagnostics console, the other still gloved in welding gear dusted with metallic residue. 6 hours of reinforcement work had ended in the usual rhythm of fatigue and routine reports. Nothing remarkable, nothing unusual, until the tone shifted. Amber to red in a single breath. The system voice confirmed what everyone already knew before it spoke. Structural destabilization exceeded safe thresholds. Evacuation protocols initiated. No one moved for a moment, as if waiting for the mind to reconsider. Ethan exhaled slowly, not in surprise, but recognition, like a man reading the same line of fate he had seen too many times before. Deep below, Lyra pressed her palm against the corridor wall, feeling vibration travel through alloy plating into her bones. Her mission had been precise in theory: complete geological mapping, verify mineral stability, transmit core readings before extraction phase. But theory did not account for shifting underground pressure turning silence into warning. Her comm channel crackled, fragmented but alive. A human voice ordering withdrawal from outer subsections. Another transmission cut off mid-response. She turned her head toward the narrowing passage ahead, where emergency strips of light pulsed faintly like distant signals trying not to disappear. Ethan was already moving before authorization fully completed. It was not a heroic decision in his mind, only an incomplete one. Protocol said to wait. Experience said waiting was just another way of choosing nothing. He pulled his welding rig from its rack, heavier than regulation allowed for emergency response, and keyed his override into the access gate. A supervisor called after him, voice sharp with procedure, but Ethan did not slow. The descent ramp opened into colder air, each step downward stripping away the noise of command centers and replacing it with the steady hum of infrastructure under stress. Lyra paused as the corridor lights ahead flickered harder, reacting to instability spreading through the mine like ripples through glass. Her suit displayed proximity warnings, structural drift accelerating, unknown movement patterns forming in overlapping layers. She did not fully understand human construction logic, but she understood when a place stopped agreeing with itself. Far above and behind her, a second vibration entered the system, different in rhythm, deliberate, controlled. Not collapse. Motion against instruction. Ethan adjusted the oxygen regulator on his shoulder and stepped deeper into the lower shaft, where air carried the scent of heated metal and dust suspended too long in confinement. The mine had become less like a workplace and more like a question nobody wanted to answer. Somewhere ahead, a faint life signal pulsed through his HUD, weak, unstable, but persistent enough to matter. He did not assign meaning to it in words, only in action. Lyra turned again, because now the sound was not imagined. It was approaching. The sound reached Lyra then first as a distortion in her helmet audio feed. Not mechanical, but human in rhythm, steady and deliberate, moving against the background instability of the mine. Her display attempted to classify it as structural resonance, then as environmental interference, but she had spent enough time underground to know the difference between a system failing and a person refusing to stop. She pressed 2 fingers against the side of her visor, stabilizing her breathing as the corridor behind her continued to narrow in perception, not yet physically closed but already emotionally compressed by uncertainty. Above her, in the control zone, Ethan Cole stood before a locked administrative barrier that should have required authorization from 3 separate supervisors. The system denied him twice. He did not argue with it. Instead, he opened the maintenance panel beneath the console and initiated a manual bypass sequence reserved for extreme engineering emergencies, his hands moving with the calm precision of someone who had repaired consequences more times than he had been allowed to explain them. A voice from behind him ordered him to return to protocol, reminding him that Section C was already marked as non-viable for continued access. Ethan paused only long enough to look at the warning indicator, then continued the override. He had learned long ago that systems did not carry people out of mines. People did. Deep below, Lyra had stopped walking. Not because she was trapped, but because the corridor ahead no longer responded to certainty. Her mission data had once shown this route as stable, a direct passage to the primary survey junction. Now the same route appeared fragmented, recalculating in real time as if the mine itself had lost confidence in its own geometry. Her comm channel flickered again, this time clearer, and through it she heard a human voice that was no longer part of official instruction. It was closer, lower in bandwidth, stripped of command structure. Ethan Cole was not speaking to a team anymore. He was speaking to the space between them. He said only that he was still coming. The controls supervisor reached him at the secondary gate, physically placing a hand on the console, as if presence alone could restore procedure. The argument that followed was not loud, but it was absolute in its contrast: regulation versus intent, containment versus motion. Ethan did not raise his voice. He simply stated that if the readings were accurate, then there was still a life signal below that did not match the evacuation log. The supervisor replied that the mine was no longer safe for interpretation. Ethan answered that safety was not the same as truth. Then he continued downward. Lyra exhaled slowly, adjusting her suit filters as particulate levels increased, though still within survivable range. She had been trained to rely on systems, but systems were now speaking in contradictions. The only consistent variable was the approaching signal. She turned slightly toward it, not fully committing to direction, because commitment required trust and trust required certainty. Neither were available. Ethan moved through the lower access corridor where lights had shifted from white to amber, not emergency failure, but controlled warning, the mine attempting to communicate in colors instead of language. His welding equipment hung at his side, not activated, but present like a reminder that construction and collapse were often separated only by timing. He checked the signal again. It was closer now, fragmented but persistent. Lyra took one step forward, then another, each movement measured against the idea that retreat was still an option. But the sound behind her had resolved into something undeniable, not machinery, not collapse, but presence. For the first time since the mine began to change, she was not alone in interpreting it. Ethan reached the final junction before the unstable zone, where the structural map ceased to be reliable. He stopped there only long enough to orient himself, then stepped past the line marked in red. Lyra turned fully toward the source at the exact moment his light appeared at the far end of the corridor, cutting through suspended dust like a steady decision made visible. Neither of them spoke yet. The mine, for a brief moment, did not decide anything either. The light at the end of the corridor did not flicker the way emergency systems usually did. It held steady, not bright enough to suggest safety, but consistent enough to suggest intention. Lyra Vin remained still for a moment, her visor tracking the approaching figure while her mind attempted to reconcile what she was seeing with every protocol she had been trained to trust. The mine was unstable, yet something was moving through it with purpose. Ethan Cole stepped forward slowly, his boots pressing into dust that shifted under controlled vibration rather than collapse. His welding torch was still off, hanging at his side like an unused decision, but the glow from his helmet lamp cut through the corridor with a kind of practical patience that felt out of place in a system marked for evacuation. He stopped at a distance that was not dictated by regulation but by instinct, as if both of them understood that too much proximity would turn uncertainty into something heavier. Lyra spoke first, her voice filtered through her suit, but steady despite the environment. She asked if he was authorized to be here. Ethan answered that authorization had already been lost somewhere above them. For a brief moment, neither system nor protocol intervened. Only silence filled the space between them, shaped by dust particles drifting in low-gravity air currents. Lyra adjusted her stance, scanning his equipment. He carried no rescue designation, no formal extraction clearance, only industrial tools designed for repair. That detail should have made her more cautious, but instead it introduced a different kind of logic. Repairs implied continuation. Continuation implied possibility. Above them, Structural sensors sent intermittent updates that no longer aligned with physical reality. Sections of the mine were marked as compromised, yet still standing. Others were marked stable, yet vibrating with unseen stress. The contradiction had become total, leaving only human judgment as the remaining variable. Ethan glanced down the corridor behind Lyra, then back at her, confirming the signal he had been following matched the person standing in front of him. He did not ask why she was still here. He already knew the answer was the same reason he had continued moving downward when every system told him to stop. Lyra finally lowered her gaze slightly, acknowledging the inconsistency in her own situation. She had been told extraction was no longer possible. She had been told survival probability had dropped below acceptable thresholds. Yet she was still standing, and so was he. Ethan shifted his weight and activated a small portable light array, not for visibility alone, but for stability mapping. The corridor responded with faint reflections off fractured mineral surfaces, revealing pathways that were no longer fully aligned but still passable with caution. He stated that they needed to move upward together before the structure fully settled into failure. Lyra hesitated, not out of fear of him, but out of recalibration of expectation. She had been trained to rely on extraction teams, on coordinated response units, on structured rescue protocols. None of those existed in this moment. Only a human welder and a collapsing mine that had already stopped following its own design. Finally, she stepped forward. Not quickly, not with certainty, but with the decision that staying still would accomplish nothing. Ethan adjusted his pace to match hers without instruction. As they moved, the mine continued to shift, but no longer felt entirely hostile. It felt unstable in a way that required cooperation rather than avoidance. Lyra glanced at him once as they walked, noticing the way he constantly monitored structural points rather than open space, as if he was reading the environment like a language she had never been taught. Ethan did not look back at her, but his voice carried forward quietly, stating that he would find them a way out even if the official route no longer existed. In that narrow corridor of dust and fractured light, the idea of rescue stopped being theoretical. It became motion. The corridor they moved through no longer resembled a planned industrial passage, but a structure in negotiation with itself. Every few seconds, Lyra Vin's visor updated with micro shifts in geometry, recalculating distances that should have been fixed but were instead behaving like living estimates. Ethan Cole stayed slightly ahead of her, not in command but in awareness, his helmet lights sweeping slow arcs across fractured surfaces as if he was listening to the mine rather than merely observing it. He stopped once, placing a gloved hand against a support beam that carried a faint but irregular vibration. Lyra watched him without speaking, noting how he did not treat the instability as an emergency, but as a problem that still had remaining options. Above them, distant structural alerts continued to cycle, but the meaning of those alerts had begun to degrade into repetition without certainty. Ethan reached into his tool harness and retrieved a compact thermal welding unit, not activating it yet, but checking its calibration by instinct alone. He explained calmly that if the structural mapping was no longer reliable, they would need to rely on material behavior instead of system predictions. Lyra processed the statement slowly, recognizing that he was substituting engineering judgment for collapsed infrastructure logic. That distinction mattered. It meant he was not navigating by authority, but by understanding. The passage ahead narrowed slightly, where metal reinforcement had buckled under uneven pressure. Dust drifted downward in thin streams, suggesting movement above layers they could not see. Lyra adjusted her footing, careful to maintain balance as the floor subtly shifted in response to internal stress redistribution. She asked if he had done this kind of work in environments like this before. Ethan answered without looking back that mines were not new to him, only different versions of the same problem. The answer carried no pride, only familiarity. A faint oscillation passed through the corridor, causing both of them to pause. Ethan immediately adjusted his stance, scanning support points rather than the open space. Lyra followed his gaze and realized he was reading load distribution in real time, identifying where failure was most likely to propagate next. It was not something taught in her mission briefing. It was learned behavior. They continued forward, now moving through a section where emergency lighting had dimmed to near uncertainty. The illumination came instead from Ethan's portable array and the reflective surfaces of fractured mineral walls. Shadows stretched unevenly, creating illusions of depth that did not match measured distance. Lyra's comm system attempted another stability report, but the data degraded mid-transmission. She disabled the feed, choosing silence over corrupted guidance. Ahead, Ethan slowed again. The corridor opened into a partially collapsed junction where multiple tunnels intersected at angles no longer consistent with the original blueprint. Here, the mine felt less like a single structure and more like competing decisions frozen in place. Ethan studied the junction for several seconds, then moved closer to a central support column. He explained that this point had carried redistributed load from at least 3 sections above, meaning it was both critical and unstable in equal measure. Lyra stepped beside him, observing the same structure through her own instruments, but arriving at the conclusion only after his explanation had already formed. For a moment, the difference between them was not knowledge but interpretation speed. Ethan activated his welding unit briefly, not to cut or dismantle, but to reinforce a microfracture that could have expanded under continued stress. The sound was controlled, precise, almost calm. Lyra watched the material respond, noting how small adjustments altered the behavior of the entire junction. It was the first moment she understood that stability here was not a condition but a continuous act. As the weld cooled, Ethan signaled forward movement again. There was no announcement of progress, no confirmation of safety, only continuation. Lyra followed, now matching his pace more naturally, as if the mine had begun to accept their presence as part of its equation. Behind them, faint shifts continued in the structure they had passed through, but ahead, there was still a path that had not yet decided what it would become. The junction behind them faded into a dimmer rhythm of unstable light as Lyra Vin and Ethan Cole continued deeper into the shifting structure of the mine. The passage ahead was no longer clearly defined by architecture but by probability, as if every meter of tunnel existed only because it had not yet been forced to decide otherwise. Lyra's instruments continued to struggle with consistency, showing multiple overlapping readings for the same physical space, while Ethan relied on direct observation, adjusting his movement based on how the environment responded rather than what it claimed to be. He paused briefly to recalibrate his portable light array, narrowing the beam to reduce scatter across fractured surfaces. The mine reacted subtly, shadows tightening and loosening in response, as though light itself was becoming part of the structural conversation. Lyra noticed that Ethan was no longer simply guiding her forward but also monitoring her stability, occasionally adjusting his pace when her steps slowed, ensuring she remained within the safer corridor band. She did not request this assistance, but she also did not reject it. The silence between them had evolved into a working equilibrium. Ahead, the corridor widened slightly into a long compression chamber where reinforcement ribs ran along the walls at irregular intervals. Dust moved in slow suspended currents, revealing faint air displacement patterns that suggested pressure shifting from above. Ethan stopped at the threshold and studied the chamber carefully, his attention focused on the ceiling supports and the way load distribution had changed over time. He stated quietly that this section had been partially deformed by repeated stress cycles rather than a single collapse event, meaning the structure might still hold if movement remained controlled. Lyra processed the assessment, comparing it against her own readouts, which were still lagging behind reality by several seconds. The difference between prediction and observation was becoming more pronounced the deeper they went. She asked if he trusted what he was seeing more than what the mine systems were reporting. Ethan replied that systems were only as accurate as the conditions they were designed to measure, and that when conditions changed faster than updates, observation became the only reliable input. The answer carried no dismissal of technology, only an acknowledgement of its limits. They entered the chamber slowly. The floor here was smoother, but not stable, carrying faint vibrations that suggested structural tension beneath the surface rather than above it. Lyra adjusted her stance carefully, tracking each shift in balance through her suit interface, while also beginning to rely more on physical sensation than instrumentation. It was an unfamiliar form of awareness, but increasingly necessary. Ethan moved toward the center of the chamber, where a vertical support spine ran from floor to ceiling, its surface marked by subtle stress lines that indicated long-term strain. He placed his hand against it briefly, then withdrew, noting that the material was still responding within acceptable deformation thresholds, but only barely. He explained that this section would require controlled passage, meaning they could not rush or pause for too long, as both extremes would increase instability. Lyra nodded slightly, absorbing the logic even as she realized how much of their survival now depended on timing rather than design. As they advanced through the chamber, a faint resonance began to build through the structure, not loud enough to be alarming, but present enough to demand attention. Ethan immediately slowed, scanning for the source of the vibration, then identified it as a redistribution of load from an upper fractured segment. Lyra's system confirmed the same shift a few seconds later, reinforcing the gap between human perception and automated delay. Ethan adjusted their route subtly, guiding them closer to a reinforced edge corridor that offered marginally better support distribution. Lyra followed without hesitation, recognizing that deviation here was not error but adaptation. Midway through the chamber, they paused briefly beneath a section where the ceiling had been reinforced multiple times over older damage lines. Ethan observed the overlapping structural repairs and noted that previous teams had attempted stabilization without addressing underlying stress flow, resulting in layered weakness rather than resolution. Lyra listened, realizing that his interpretation treated the mine as a continuous system rather than isolated incidents. It was a perspective her mission framework had not fully emphasized. As they resumed movement, the resonance began to fade slightly, suggesting their adjusted path had reduced structural strain. The chamber ahead opened toward another transition point, where visibility decreased but airflow improved, indicating a potential route toward higher levels. Ethan confirmed the direction with a brief scan, then continued forward without marking the achievement as success. Lyra followed, now more aligned with his pace than her own instrumentation, as the mine continued its silent recalibration around their presence. The corridor ahead shifted into a quieter state of instability, where movement was less about visible collapse and more about structural hesitation, as if the mine itself was reconsidering its own decisions in real time. Lyra then noticed the change first through her suit feedback, which showed a gradual reduction in abrupt pressure spikes, replaced instead by long, uneven waves of tension spreading through distant supports. Ethan Cole slowed his pace without being prompted, adjusting his scanning pattern to match the new rhythm of the environment. He stated calmly that this section was not actively failing, but was under redistributed stress, meaning they were likely moving along a transitional zone between damaged and semi-stable regions. Lyra absorbed the distinction, recognizing that survival underground was not defined by safety alone, but by gradients of risk that changed from meter to meter. Ethan raised his portable light slightly, sweeping it across the corridor ahead where the tunnel narrowed again, revealing faint reinforcement ribs embedded into older rock layers. These structures showed signs of repeated repair, suggesting multiple past attempts to maintain functionality despite persistent instability. He commented quietly that this kind of layering usually indicated a mine that had been pushed beyond its original design limits. Lyra responded by checking her remaining oxygen reserves, which remained stable but no longer felt reassuring in the way they had at the surface. The deeper they traveled, the less meaningful isolated metrics had become. A subtle shift passed through the floor beneath them, not a collapse, but a controlled settling, like the structure was adjusting its internal balance. Ethan immediately paused, placing one hand near the ground to feel vibration through the surface material. He explained that the mine was still reacting to earlier stress redistribution from their passage, meaning their movement had already influenced structural behavior behind them. Lyra looked back briefly, realizing that their presence was no longer neutral. They were part of the system now. They continued forward into a narrower passage where airflow increased slightly, carrying cooler currents from unknown depths. The temperature drop was gradual but noticeable, recorded by Lyra's suit as a shift of approximately 3 degrees Fahrenheit over several hundred feet. Ethan noted that improved airflow often indicated proximity to secondary ventilation channels, which could lead toward maintenance access routes or emergency exits. Lyra asked if those routes would still be intact given the current instability. Ethan replied that intact was not the correct expectation, only partially usable. The distinction was important. They moved carefully through the narrowing passage, where the walls showed faint deformation patterns, indicating long-term pressure adjustment rather than sudden failure. Lyra's attention drifted briefly to Ethan's movements, observing how he maintained constant awareness of structural symmetry, adjusting his position in subtle increments to avoid unnecessary load concentration. It was not calculated through instruments, but through experience, as if his body had learned how materials responded under stress. Ahead, a faint interruption appeared in the corridor lighting, where one of the embedded strips flickered intermittently before stabilizing again. Ethan identified it as a power irregularity caused by structural flexion affecting wiring channels. He did not treat it as a threat, only as information. Lyra began to realize that his entire approach to the environment was built on interpretation rather than reaction. When they reached a minor split in the passage, Ethan paused longer than before, comparing both paths through visual inspection and environmental feedback. One route showed smoother airflow but more visible microfractures along the ceiling. The other showed tighter confinement but more consistent structural continuity. He chose the second option without hesitation, explaining that consistency was more valuable than apparent ease when dealing with shifting loads. Lyra followed, trusting the reasoning even as she continued to adapt her own perception of risk. As they entered the selected passage, the mine's overall vibration pattern shifted again, becoming more uniform and less chaotic. It did not mean stability had returned, but rather that they were moving through a region where stress had already settled into predictable forms. Ethan acknowledged this quietly, stating that predictability, even in failure, was preferable to uncertainty. Lyra understood the implication without needing further explanation. They continued deeper, aligned now not by protocol or hierarchy, but by shared interpretation of a system that no longer behaved according to its original design. The passage they entered carried a different kind of pressure than the previous sections of the mine, not measured in visible deformation, but in the way the air itself felt more structured, as if the environment had settled into a temporary agreement with physics rather than resisting it. Lyra then adjusted her breathing rhythm, noticing that her suit no longer needed constant recalibration, which suggested that local conditions had reached a rare state of relative equilibrium. Ethan Cole slowed his steps, scanning the corridor ahead where the tunnel widened into a long maintenance conduit lined with partially exposed service rails and dormant cable channels. He explained quietly that this type of section was typically used for emergency rerouting of power and ventilation systems, which meant it had been designed with redundancy in mind, offering multiple fallback paths if primary structures failed. Lyra processed the information while observing how Ethan consistently moved closer to the structural centerline, avoiding wall proximity where stress fractures tended to concentrate. There was no hesitation in his movement, only continuous adjustment based on environmental feedback. As they advanced, faint remnants of older repair work became visible along the walls, including reinforcement patches that had been applied at different points in time, each layer slightly misaligned with the next. Ethan paused briefly to inspect one of these sections, noting that multiple generations of repair indicated a system that had been repeatedly stressed beyond initial engineering expectations. Lyra asked whether that made the current section more or less stable. Ethan replied that it made it more predictable, which in practical terms was more useful than stability itself. They continued forward, the corridor gradually transitioning into a broader junction where airflow increased noticeably, suggesting connection to a larger ventilation network. The temperature dropped slightly again, registering a change of approximately 2 degrees Fahrenheit over a short distance, and Lyra's suit adjusted accordingly, compensating for the environmental shift. Ethan stopped at the edge of the junction and studied the branching paths ahead, his attention moving between airflow direction, dust patterns, and subtle vibration feedback transmitted through the floor. He explained that one of the paths likely led toward a secondary extraction shaft, while the other appeared to loop back into deeper structural zones that were not mapped in current system data. Lyra reviewed her own readings, which were fragmented but partially aligned with his assessment, though delayed enough to be less reliable in real-time decision-making. Ethan chose the left passage after a brief pause, stating that airflow consistency suggested upward movement potential, even if the route was not officially documented. Lyra followed without objection, now fully aware that her decision-making had shifted from independent analysis to trust-based observation of his interpretations. As they moved through the selected passage, the environment changed subtly again, with fewer visible fractures but more subtle vibrations transmitted through the structural frame. Ethan placed a hand briefly against the wall, confirming that the material density had increased, which often indicated proximity to load-bearing intersections. Lyra noticed that he rarely relied on instruments unless necessary, instead prioritizing tactile and auditory cues that most systems did not account for. The corridor narrowed slightly before opening into another transitional segment where faint emergency markers appeared along the upper edges of the tunnel, partially obscured by dust accumulation. Ethan identified these markers as legacy guidance indicators, likely installed during earlier construction phases and never fully deactivated. He stated that such markers often indicated proximity to service exits, though their reliability depended on how much the structure had shifted since installation. Lyra felt a subtle increase in hope, not as certainty, but as probability shifting in a favorable direction. The mine's overall vibration pattern remained steady, no longer escalating in intensity, which suggested they had moved beyond the most unstable region. Ethan confirmed this assessment quietly, noting that structural stress indicators were now distributed rather than concentrated, which reduced the likelihood of sudden system-wide failure in their immediate vicinity. They continued forward together, the passage ahead still uncertain but increasingly defined by pathways that remained intact through repetition of past maintenance rather than original design intent. In this space, survival was no longer about escaping collapse, but about following the memory of infrastructure that still remembered how to function. The passage ahead finally began to show signs of upward intent rather than lateral displacement, as faint changes in airflow suggested proximity to a ventilation convergence point higher in the structure. Lyra then noticed the difference first through her suit's atmospheric analysis, which indicated a gradual improvement in oxygen circulation patterns, though still far below surface baseline conditions. Ethan Cole confirmed the observation without relying on instrumentation, simply by feeling the shift in air movement across his exposed glove as they moved deeper into the corridor. He stated quietly that ventilation systems always created subtle pressure gradients that could be followed like currents in water, even when structural mapping failed. Lyra adjusted her pace to match his, now more attuned to environmental cues than digital feedback, as her systems continued to lag behind real-time conditions by critical seconds. The corridor widened slightly, revealing a long inclined section reinforced with older support arches that had been reinforced multiple times over years of incremental maintenance. Ethan slowed here, scanning the ceiling where overlapping reinforcement plates indicated stress redistribution from multiple eras of structural repair. He explained that this kind of layered reinforcement often meant the original design had been exceeded long ago, but the system had adapted through continuous patching rather than full reconstruction. Lyra processed this information while observing how Ethan maintained constant awareness of overhead load distribution, adjusting his position subtly to avoid unnecessary stress on compromised zones. Ahead, faint illumination markers appeared along the upper edge of the passage, dim but still functioning, suggesting that some level of emergency infrastructure remained operational in this region. Ethan identified the markers as directional guides for maintenance crews, likely leading toward auxiliary access routes rather than primary exits, but still valuable for upward navigation. Lyra felt a controlled shift in her internal metrics, as survival probability calculations began to stabilize rather than fluctuate wildly. It was not certainty, but it was direction. As they moved up the incline, a faint mechanical resonance became audible through the structure, not a sign of collapse, but of distant systems still operating under partial load. Ethan paused briefly, listening with focus rather than alarm, then stated that active systems meant they were approaching zones that had not fully failed, which increased the likelihood of reaching a functional exit network. Lyra followed his gaze toward the source of the resonance, noticing how the corridor walls here showed less fracturing and more consistent material integrity, as if this section had been preserved by continued use rather than abandonment. The incline gradually leveled into a broad transition chamber where ventilation ducts intersected with structural beams in a dense network overhead. Ethan examined the layout carefully, identifying one duct that showed stronger airflow and more consistent pressure output. He explained that this likely connected to a secondary surface shaft or emergency venting column. Lyra checked her readings, which now aligned more closely with physical observation, though still slightly delayed in response. For the first time since entering the mine, her systems were beginning to synchronize with reality rather than interpret it. Ethan moved toward the identified duct access point, noting that it would require careful passage through a narrow maintenance opening reinforced by older locking mechanisms. He retrieved his compact welding tool, not to cut aggressively, but to carefully release structural restraints without destabilizing surrounding support frames. Lyra observed the precision of his movements, recognizing that each action was designed to preserve as much structural integrity as possible while still creating forward access. The mine around them remained stable enough to allow controlled progression, though faint vibrations still traveled through distant sections, reminding them that instability had not disappeared, only moved elsewhere. As Ethan worked on the access point, Lyra positioned herself nearby, monitoring both environmental changes and his actions, now fully integrated into a shared understanding of movement through compromised infrastructure. The opening finally yielded with minimal resistance, revealing a narrow vertical passage beyond, carrying noticeably stronger airflow and cooler air from above. Ethan stated calmly that this was likely their best path towards surface-level systems. Lyra stepped closer to the opening, sensing for the first time in a long cycle of descent and uncertainty that upward movement was no longer theoretical but achievable through continuous, careful effort rather than chance. Together, they prepared to transition into the vertical route, leaving behind the horizontal corridors that had once defined uncertainty and entering a path shaped by direction rather than instability. The vertical passage above them carried a steady upward pull of air, stronger now, confirming that surface ventilation systems were still active somewhere beyond the damaged layers of the mine. Lyra then looked upward first, her visor adjusting exposure as faint natural light frequencies began to blend with artificial maintenance illumination, creating an uneven but unmistakable gradient of ascent. Ethan Cole positioned himself beneath the access frame, inspecting the narrow shaft that rose at an angle through reinforced rock and maintenance scaffolding. He explained quietly that this type of vertical route was designed for emergency extraction, meaning it would bypass most of the structural damage concentrated in the horizontal tunnels below. Lyra stepped closer, recognizing that the airflow here was no longer erratic but directional, moving upward in consistent pulses that suggested functioning systems beyond their current depth. Ethan secured his welding tool to a lower anchor point and tested the stability of the entry frame before signaling that they could proceed. The climb was not fast, but it was controlled, each movement guided by careful placement rather than urgency. Lyra followed closely behind Ethan, adjusting her grip on embedded rungs that had been partially reinforced over time, their surfaces worn but still structurally reliable. As they ascended, the mine's vibration patterns diminished further, transitioning from chaotic interference to a steady background hum that suggested distance from the most unstable zones. Ethan paused once during the climb to check a side support beam, noting that while the structure showed signs of stress, it remained within safe tolerance for continued passage if movement remained deliberate. Lyra observed how his attention remained divided between immediate physical stability and broader environmental feedback, as if he was continuously translating the mine's condition into actionable interpretation. After several minutes of steady ascent, a faint brightness appeared above them, not artificial but diffuse, indicating proximity to the surface-level lighting system. Lyra's suit registered a significant improvement in atmospheric quality, with oxygen levels rising and particulate density decreasing steadily. Ethan confirmed the change by lowering his head slightly, noting the presence of fresh airflow entering the shaft from above. The climb continued until the passage widened into a final transitional chamber, where structural supports gave way to a reinforced access hatch leading to the surface network. Ethan inspected the hatch mechanism, identifying it as a manual override system designed for emergency evacuation. He explained that it would require controlled release to avoid sudden pressure shifts that could destabilize the shaft below. Lyra stood beside him, now fully aware that the mine beneath them had shifted from unpredictable instability to residual stress, no longer actively collapsing, but still sensitive to external disturbance. Ethan engaged the release mechanism carefully, applying gradual force while monitoring structural feedback through both tactile sensation and visual indicators. The hatch responded slowly, resisting at first, then yielding in measured increments. As it opened, a stronger flow of air descended through the shaft, carrying with it the unmistakable presence of open space above ground. Lyra paused at the threshold, her visor adjusting to increased brightness as natural light filtered downward through the opening. Ethan stepped slightly aside, allowing her first view upward. The surface access corridor beyond was intact, illuminated by functional emergency lighting and partially visible structural frames leading toward open exit points. There was no dramatic declaration, no sudden reversal of conditions, only continuity becoming visible after prolonged uncertainty. Lyra ascended the final section carefully, stepping onto stable ground as Ethan followed closely behind. The transition from enclosed mine to surface access zone was gradual, marked by diminishing vibration and increasing environmental clarity. Above them, the remaining infrastructure extended toward open-air systems where natural light fully replaced artificial guidance. Ethan confirmed quietly that they had reached functional exit depth. Lyra stood still for a moment, processing the shift from confined instability to structured openness. The mine was no longer a collapsing environment behind them, but a system that had been navigated rather than defeated. Ethan lowered his tools and looked toward the final exit corridor, where daylight filtered in from beyond reinforced barriers. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. The silence was no longer shaped by danger, but by completion. Then they continued forward together toward the surface, where the weight of the underground finally gave way to open air and steady light.